The morning of June 16, 1943. 7 Mile Drome, Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. Technical Sergeant Herbert Pugh watched the first rays of tropical sunlight glint off the twin 50 caliber machine guns protruding from the waist position of B-17E serial number 412666. The modifications his crew had welded into place over the past 3 weeks violated at least a dozen technical orders from right field. The twin gun mounts exceeded weight distribution limits. The fixed nose gun wired to the pilot's control yoke bypassed approved electrical systems. The removal of ammunition feed equipment and cartridge belts contradicted maintenance manuals. Every modification represented a choice between following regulations and coming home alive. What Sergeant Pugh did not yet know was that in approximately 4 hours, those unauthorized modifications would face their ultimate test against 20 Japanese Zero fighters over Bougainville. And what none of the mechanics at 7 Mile Drome understood was that their improvised solutions to keep battle-damaged bombers flying, solutions that officially did not exist and could not be discussed in after-action reports, would quietly revolutionize how the United States Army Air Forces approached field maintenance throughout the Pacific War. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story begins not with that mission over Bougainville, but 3 months earlier in March 1943, when Captain Jay Zeamer walked past the boneyard at Port Moresby and saw a bomber that officially no longer existed, B-17E 412666. Sat at the end of the flight line, its olive drab paint faded and scarred, its engines cannibalized for parts, its fuselage punctured with so many patched bullet holes that crews had started calling it the Flying Colander. The aircraft had gained a reputation. Every mission it flew, it returned shot to pieces. 4 different crews had flown it. 3 had taken casualties. The 4th refused to fly it again. Now it awaited final scrapping, its useful life apparently finished. Zeamer saw something different. He saw an aircraft that kept coming back. The United States Army Air Forces operated in the Southwest Pacific under conditions that made European theater logistics look simple. Every spare part, every gallon of fuel, every replacement aircraft traveled thousands of miles by ship through submarine-infested waters. When a B-17 went down, you could not simply request a replacement and expect delivery in days. Replacement aircraft might take months to arrive. Meanwhile, Japanese forces controlled Rabaul, the most heavily defended position in the South Pacific, and launched daily attacks against Allied positions. The 5th Air Force needed every bomber it could put in the air. This created an impossible equation for maintenance crews. Official regulations specified precise procedures for battle damage repair. Technical Order 1 B-17A-2-1, Aircraft Structural Repair Manual, ran to 412 pages of detailed instructions. Each repair required specific materials, approved techniques, documentation, and inspection by qualified personnel. Welds had to meet precise specifications. Patches required certified dimensions. Structural modifications demanded engineering analysis. But combat crews did not have time for engineering analysis. When a B-17 landed with a 16-inch hole in the wing from an 88mm shell, the crew chief had perhaps 36 hours before that aircraft needed to fly again. Maybe less. The manual said to replace the damaged wing section with a factory-fabricated part following approved procedures. That part might be in Australia. It might be on a ship still crossing the Pacific. It probably did not exist anywhere in theatre. So, mechanics. Improvised. They cut patches from damaged aircraft awaiting scrapping. They welded reinforcements using whatever steel they could find. They fabricated brackets and mounts in field workshops equipped with tools never intended for aircraft maintenance. They learned which repairs would hold under combat stress and which would fail catastrophically. They developed institutional knowledge that existed nowhere in official documentation. This knowledge passed between mechanics the way trade secrets passed between medieval craftsmen, quietly, informally, in conversations that officially never happened. A crew chief from the 93rd Bomb Squadron would mention to a colleague from the 65th that welding a doubler plate at a certain angle provided better strength than the manual's approved method. A sheet metal worker would show another how salvaged aluminum from a crashed B-24 could be reformed to patch B-17 skin. An engine mechanic would explain how you could swap a Wright R1820 engine cylinder from position 4 to position 7 to keep a power plant running when the proper replacement part was 3,000 miles away. None of this appeared in maintenance logs. Official records showed only that damaged aircraft were repaired and returned to service. The methods remained undocumented because documenting them would require admitting they violated established procedures, and the regulations were clear. Unapproved repairs voided aircraft certification. Mechanics who performed unapproved structural modifications could face court-martial for willfully damaging government property. Officers who knowingly allowed such repairs shared responsibility, so a quiet understanding developed between squadron commanders and maintenance chiefs. Commanders needed aircraft in the air. Maintenance chiefs needed latitude to keep aircraft airworthy. Both understood that strictly following regulations would ground half the bomber force at any given time. The unofficial policy became, achieve the mission, keep crews safe, do not ask too many questions about methods, and for God's sake, do not put unapproved procedures in writing. Captain Jay Zeamer understood this environment perfectly. 25 years old, he had washed out of pilot training twice due to what instructors called insufficient aggressiveness on the controls. He had spent a year flying as a co-pilot, watching other officers command aircraft while he handled routine duties. When he finally qualified as first pilot in November 1942, his reputation as a nonconformist who questioned orders and ignored protocol meant senior officers hesitated to assign him a crew or aircraft. So he assembled his own crew from other men the system had marginalized. Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnowski, the bombardier, had a reputation for speaking his mind to officers of higher rank. Staff Sergeant George Kendrick, the photographer, preferred flying to military discipline. Technical Sergeant Herbert Pugh, the engineer, cared more about keeping aircraft flying than following maintenance schedules. Together they became known as the Eager Beavers, a nickname that started as mockery of their constant volunteering for missions but evolved into something approaching respect. When Zeamer spotted 412666 in the boneyard, he saw an opportunity. The aircraft still had a valid airframe, its structure fundamentally sound despite cosmetic damage. Its engines had been removed, but engines could be replaced. Its systems had been scavenged, but systems could be rebuilt. Most importantly, it was available. No other officer wanted it. No other crew would fly it. This gave Zeamer room to operate. He requisitioned the aircraft through proper channels, filling out the forms, getting the signatures, making it official. Squadron operations approved the request with barely concealed amusement. Let the misfit pilot have the misfit bomber. If he wanted to waste his time restoring an aircraft everyone else considered scrap, that was his problem. Zeamer and his crew moved 412666 to an isolated revetment and went to work. They did not ask permission for what came next, because they knew permission would be denied. Instead, they followed the unwritten protocol: work quietly, work quickly, deliver results, let the results speak for themselves. The first modification addressed weight. The B-17E in early configuration carried substantial equipment that served no purpose in Pacific combat. Cartridge belt links weighing hundreds of pounds connected machine gun ammunition in a continuous feed system designed for European missions, where bombers might face multiple waves of enemy fighters over hours of flight time. In the Pacific, combat lasted 20 to 30 minutes at most. The crew removed the belt links, substituting box magazines that fed directly into weapons. This saved £400. They stripped out oxygen system components intended for flights at 30,000 feet. In the Pacific theatre, most missions flew at 15 to 20,000 feet, where ambient air provided enough oxygen without supplemental systems. Another £200 removed. They discarded spare parts storage, emergency equipment, and duplicate systems. After 3 days of methodical stripping, the bomber weighed almost 2,000 pounds less than factory specification. This weight reduction violated Technical Order 1B17A-1, Weight and Balance Manual. That manual specified maximum and minimum equipment loads for each aircraft variant. Removing authorized equipment changed the aircraft's center of gravity, potentially affecting flight characteristics. The proper procedure required recalculating weight distribution, submitting revised specifications to Wright Field for engineering review, and obtaining approval before flying the modified aircraft. Zeamer never submitted anything for review. He test flew the lightened bomber on May 18th, confirmed it handled better than standard configuration, and declared the modification successful. If maintenance logs mentioned the weight reduction at all, they noted only that unnecessary equipment had been removed in accordance with theatre-specific operational requirements. This phrasing provided plausible deniability while avoiding the word unapproved. The second set of modifications addressed firepower. Standard B-17E configuration in the Pacific carried 12 50 caliber machine guns, 2 in the nose, 2 in the dorsal turret, 2 in the ventral ball turret, 1 in the radio compartment, 2 in the waist positions, and 2 in the tail. This armament proved inadequate against Japanese fighters employing head-on attacks. The nose guns, manually operated by the bombardier and navigator, could not train quickly enough to track fighters approaching at closure rates exceeding 500 miles per hour. Previous crews had experimented with solutions. Captain Ken McCullough, a pilot Zeamer knew from the 43rd Bomb Group, had installed a fixed 50 caliber in the nose of his B-17, wired so he could fire it from the control yoke like a fighter pilot. McCullough's aircraft crashed in February 1943, killing him and most of his crew, but the fixed gun concept proved sound. Other pilots who flew aircraft with this modification reported shooting down enemy fighters during head-on passes. Zeamer adopted this design, but his crew improved the installation. Instead of mounting the weapon to existing structure, they fabricated a custom bracket that positioned the gun precisely aligned with the pilot's sightline. They routed electrical wiring through existing cable runs to avoid visible modifications to cockpit controls. The installation appeared almost factory standard. Almost, but not quite. No technical order authorized this configuration. No blueprint existed for the mounting bracket. No inspection checklist covered the electrical modifications. If an aircraft accident investigation board examined the system after a crash, they would immediately flag multiple violations: unauthorized structural modifications to the nose section, unapproved electrical work on flight control systems, installation of weapons systems without engineering approval. Any of these could result in charges against the crew chief and the aircraft commander. But the aircraft had not crashed. It flew perfectly, and Zeamer now had a forward-firing weapon that gave him options when fighters attacked head-on. The third modification pushed even further beyond regulation. Zeamer wanted twin 50 caliber mounts in both waist positions and the radio compartment. Standard configuration placed single guns in each location. The twin gun concept existed. Some 19 bomb group aircraft had experimented with the design in late 1942, but no official approval authorized field modifications to create these mounts. The technical challenges were substantial. Each 50 caliber machine gun weighed 84 pounds. Ammunition boxes added another 60 pounds per gun. A twin gun mount needed to support more than 280 pounds, while allowing the gunner to traverse the weapons through a 180-degree arc. This required custom fabrication of swivel mounts, reinforcement of fuselage structure to handle increased stress, and modification of ammunition storage. Technical Sergeant Herbert Pugh and his crew spent 2 weeks on the twin-gun installations. They welded reinforcing doublers to the interior fuselage frames. They manufactured swivel mounts in the base machine shop, working from hand-drawn sketches rather than formal blueprints. They tested each installation by hanging weights equivalent to 2 loaded machine guns and manually traversing the mount through its full range of motion while watching for structural flexing. No engineering analysis validated their work. No stress calculations proved the reinforcements would hold under combat loads. No inspector certified the installations met strength requirements. The crew relied on experience, intuition, and the knowledge that similar modifications on other aircraft had not failed catastrophically. When they finished, 4.12666 carried 16 active 50 caliber machine guns, 4 more than standard B-17E configuration. Additional spare weapons stowed in the bomb bay brought the total to 19. The aircraft now possessed firepower comparable to a heavily armed fighter, but delivered from a platform with the range and endurance of a heavy bomber. On paper, the modifications should not have worked. The aircraft exceeded design weight limits for defensive armament. The custom mounts had no safety margin calculation. The electrical modifications bypassed circuit protection systems. Any one of these issues should have triggered rejection during pre-flight inspection. But pre-flight inspections in the Southwest Pacific focused on whether aircraft could complete their missions, not whether they complied with technical orders written at right field. The crew chief signed off that the systems functioned. The pilot confirmed controls responded properly. The squadron commander needed bombers in the air. 4.12666 met those requirements. The aircraft flew its first mission under Zeamer's command on May 5, 1943, a reconnaissance run over Madang, New Guinea. Japanese anti-aircraft fire hit the bomber more than 60 times. Shells punctured the oxygen system, fragments damaged the horizontal stabilizer. The aircraft landed safely with 6 wounded crew members. Maintenance crews patched the holes, replaced damaged components, and returned the bomber to service within 48 hours. On May 9th, Zeamer and his crew flew Old 666, the name was starting to stick, on a low-level strike against a Japanese convoy near Wewak. They descended to 900 feet, attack enemy searchlight positions, deliberately making themselves targets to protect other bombers. Anti-aircraft fire tore through the wing structures. One engine lost oil pressure. The aircraft completed the mission and returned to base. These missions validated the modifications while highlighting an uncomfortable truth. The aircraft performed exactly as designed, absorbing battle damage and keeping its crew alive through superior firepower and structural resilience. But every mission generated damage that required repairs explicitly forbidden by technical orders. When shells punctured wing skin, mechanics cut patches from scrap aluminum and welded them in place rather than waiting weeks for replacement panels. When a control cable severed, they spliced it using a technique learned from other mechanics rather than the approved method specified in maintenance manuals. When structural frames cracked under stress, they welded doublers over the cracks rather than replacing entire frame sections. Each repair represented a choice between following procedure and keeping aircraft operational. Each choice created potential liability, and each successful mission proved the mechanics understood their aircraft better than engineers thousands of miles away who had never seen battle damage. By early June 1943, 4.12666 had flown 5 combat missions under Zeamer's command. The aircraft officially did not exist in this configuration. Maintenance logs documented repairs but never mentioned modifications. Performance reports praised mission results without discussing unauthorized equipment. Everyone involved, from mechanics to squadron commanders to group operations officers, understood the situation and chose not to examine it too closely. This arrangement worked because it had to work. The alternative was grounding aircraft for months while awaiting parts and approvals. In a theater where every bomber mattered, where the difference between air superiority and Japanese control often came down to a dozen aircraft, pragmatism overrode protocol. Then came June 16th. The mission initially seemed routine, a photo reconnaissance run over Bougainville to support planning for future amphibious operations. 1 aircraft, no fighter escort, approximately 600 miles over open ocean. The Eager Beavers had flown similar missions before. They took off at 4 in the morning, planning to complete the photography before Japanese fighters could reach altitude. What no one anticipated was that 251 Kokutai, an elite Japanese fighter squadron, had moved to Buka airfield the previous day specifically to intercept American reconnaissance flights. When 4.12666 began its mapping run at 25,000 feet, 50 Japanese aircraft sat on the ground directly below. 17 scrambled to intercept. Technical Sergeant Herbert Pugh, watching from the waist gun position, saw them coming. He counted fighters climbing in formation, recognizing the coordinated attack pattern that Japanese pilots used against lone bombers. Standard doctrine called for the pilot to abort, diving away to escape while the altitude advantage still existed. Complete the primary mission over Bougainville first, then run. But a diving bomber could not maintain the steady, level flight required for accurate mapping photography. If Zeamer aborted, they would have to return another day, flying the same route, giving the Japanese another opportunity. And reconnaissance data grew less valuable the longer it took to collect. Intelligence needed those photographs now to plan operations scheduled for later that month. Zeamer made the decision instantly. Continue the mapping run. Hold course and altitude for the 90 seconds required to complete the photo sequence. Use those unauthorized guns to hold off the fighters. Trust the modifications his crew had installed. The first attack came from directly ahead. 3-0 fighters in formation closing at combined speed exceeding 800 miles per hour. Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnowski opened fire from the nose with the standard flexible guns. Zeamer pressed the trigger on his control yoke, firing the unauthorized fixed gun. The combined firepower ripped into the lead zero. The fighter staggered, smoke streaming, and dropped away. The second wave came from below, targeting the ball turret. Staff Sergeant William Vaughan, the ball turret gunner, tracked them smoothly, his twin 50s hammering. He hit one fighter, possibly two, fragments tearing through wing structures. The Japanese pilots broke off, circling to regroup. Then the coordinated attack began in earnest. 6 M30 fighters attacked simultaneously from multiple angles, too many targets for any single gunner to track. This was where the modifications mattered. Instead of 12 guns defending the bomber, 16 engaged. Instead of single waist guns limited in their field of fire, twin gun mounts provided overlapping coverage. Instead of gunners trying to coordinate between positions, each station delivered enough firepower to handle multiple targets. The noise was indescribable. 16 50-caliber machine guns firing simultaneously generated a sound like continuous thunder. Shell casings fountained into the fuselage, covering the floor in a golden carpet of spent brass. Cordite smoke filled the aircraft. The smell of hot metal and gun oil mixed with hydraulic fluid and aviation fuel. A 20mm cannon shell from a Zero exploded in the nose compartment. The blast blew Second Lieutenant Sarnowski away from his gun, fragments tearing through his abdomen. He fell back, blood spreading across his flight suit. Another shell hit the cockpit, shattering instruments. 4 more shells struck in rapid succession. One broke Zeamer's left leg in 2 places, just above and just below the knee. Shrapnel hit both his arms and right leg. A fragment opened a gash across his right wrist, cutting to bone. Zeamer felt his leg collapse beneath him, bones grinding against each other. Blood filled his left boot. He could not reach the rudder pedals. His vision narrowed, darkness creeping in from the edges. The aircraft began to drift right, the damaged left leg unable to maintain rudder pressure. Second Lieutenant Joe Sarnowski crawled back to his guns. Blood soaked his flight suit, but he reached the weapons and opened fire again. He hit another Zero, possibly damaged a second. Then he collapsed, unconscious or dead. Zeamer forced his right leg onto the rudder pedal, using intact muscles to substitute for the destroyed left leg. He held course through pure will, keeping the aircraft level while the camera completed its work. 90 seconds. That was all they needed. 90 seconds while shells tore through the bomber and fighters swarmed around them, and his crew fought back with unauthorized weapons that regulations said should not exist. The modifications made the difference. The twin-waist guns delivered enough firepower to force attacking fighters to break off rather than press their attacks. The radio room guns provided covering fire during the critical seconds when fighters transitioned between attacks. Even the spare weapons mattered. When one gun jammed, a crew member grabbed a spare from the catwalk and resumed firing. At the 80-second mark, the mapping run completed. Zeamer released the controls to the co-pilot, Lieutenant Ruby Johnston, who had taken shrapnel in his arms but still could fly. Zeamer keyed the intercom, his voice steady despite shock setting in. Mapping complete. Get us home. They dove from 25,000 feet to 10,000 feet, trading altitude for speed, trying to outrun fighters whose fuel must be running low. The attack continued for 40 minutes total, longer than any single engagement most bomber crews ever experienced. When the last Japanese fighters finally broke off and turned back toward Buka, 412666 was barely airworthy. The hydraulic system had failed. No brakes, no flaps, control cables were severed, forcing the pilots to use emergency backup systems. The main oxygen line was cut. 3 engines were damaged, running rough but still producing power. The aircraft had taken more than 200 hits. Second Lieutenant Sarnowski was dead. 6 crew members were wounded, some seriously. Captain Zeamer was unconscious, or nearly so, his blood pressure dropping from blood loss. Navigation instruments were destroyed. The radio was gone. They had no way to call for help, no way to determine their exact position. Staff Sergeant George Kendrick, the photographer, set his cameras aside and began first aid. He bandaged wounds, applied pressure to stop bleeding, administered morphine from the aircraft's medical kit. Other crew members who were still mobile helped navigate by keeping the sun at their backs and watching for landmarks. 4 hours later, they reached 7 Mile Drome. Lieutenant Johnston brought the crippled bomber in without hydraulics, landing hot with no flaps, touching down hard and rolling to the end of the runway before ground looping to a stop. Medics rushed to the aircraft. They found Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnowski dead at his gun position. They found Captain Jay Zeamer unconscious, approximately 120 metal fragments embedded in his body. His left leg shattered. They found 5 other wounded men who had kept fighting despite their injuries. They found an aircraft that by all engineering logic should have disintegrated under the stress of combat, but had held together through modifications that officially did not exist. The mission photographs were perfect. Clear, detailed images of Buka airfield showing Japanese fighter strength, defensive positions, and logistics facilities. The intelligence would directly support the amphibious invasion of Bougainville scheduled for November. The photographs were developed and analyzed within hours. By the next morning, operations planners were using them. Captain Zeamer spent the next 6 months in hospitals, undergoing multiple surgeries to rebuild his leg. Second Lieutenant Sarnowski was buried at Port Moresby. The rest of the crew recovered from their wounds. B-17E 412666 never flew again. The aircraft sat at 7 Mile Drome while maintenance crews assessed the damage. The final verdict: too expensive to repair even by the lenient standards of field maintenance. The aircraft was cannibalized for parts, its useful components removed to keep other bombers flying. What remained was eventually scrapped. But the modifications lived on. Within weeks, other B-17 crews were installing twin-waist guns following the pattern the eager beavers had developed. The fixed-nose gun became increasingly common, with pilots requesting the modification specifically. Even the weight reduction techniques spread, as crews discovered that stripped-down bombers flew better and survived combat more reliably. None of this happened through official channels. No technical orders documented the procedures. No engineering studies validated the designs. The knowledge spread mechanic to mechanic, crew chief to crew chief, in the informal network that kept aircraft flying despite regulations that could not keep pace with combat reality. 3 months after the Bougainville mission, Captain Jay Zeamer received the Medal of Honor. The citation praised his courage and leadership, but made no mention of unauthorized modifications. Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnowski received a posthumous Medal of Honor. Every other crew member received the Distinguished Service Cross. The mission remains one of the most highly decorated single flights in American military history. The official reports praised extraordinary valor under fire. They noted exceptional gunnery that shot down multiple enemy aircraft. They commended superior airmanship, bringing a damaged bomber home. They said nothing about violations of technical orders, unapproved modifications, or mechanics who had ignored regulations to keep aircraft combat capable. That silence was intentional. The Army Air Forces faced a choice. They could court-martial mechanics who had violated maintenance procedures. They could ground aircraft modified without proper authorization. They could enforce regulations strictly and consistently, or they could acknowledge that combat operations required flexibility that regulations could not anticipate. They could recognize that the mechanics closest to the work understood problems better than engineers thousands of miles away. They could permit field modifications that produced results even when those modifications bypassed approved procedures. The Army Air Forces chose pragmatism. They did not officially approve the modifications. They did not change technical orders to permit the work. But they quietly stopped asking too many questions about how aircraft returned to service so quickly, or why performance exceeded specifications. This unofficial policy extended throughout the Pacific Theatre. Maintenance crews at bases across New Guinea, the Solomons, and Australia developed their own modifications based on local conditions and combat experience. Some worked, some failed. The successful modifications spread through the informal network. The failures were quietly abandoned. By mid-1944, field modifications had become so common that the Army Air Forces issued a series of technical bulletins attempting to standardize the most successful designs. These bulletins documented procedures that crews had been using for more than a year, giving official sanction to modifications that had already proven themselves in combat. The process worked backward from how military procurement normally functioned. Instead of engineers designing solutions and units implementing them, units developed solutions and engineers eventually documented them. Combat drove innovation faster than official channels could respond. This pattern repeated throughout World War II. Whenever frontline personnel identified problems and developed solutions faster than bureaucracy could approve them, informal modifications proliferated. Tank crews welded additional armor onto Sherman tanks before the Army authorized the practice. Infantry units modified weapons and equipment based on combat experience long before official doctrine changed. Pilots developed tactics that violated flight manuals but kept them alive. The military's response evolved. Early in the war, unauthorized modifications could result in punishment. By late 1943, commanders tacitly accepted field modifications that improved combat effectiveness. By 1944, the services actively encouraged innovation and worked to identify successful modifications for broader implementation. This evolution reflected a fundamental shift in how the military balanced control against flexibility. Regulations existed to ensure safety, standardization, and accountability, but rigid adherence to regulations in combat could cost lives. Finding the balance between maintaining standards and allowing innovation became one of the war's critical challenges. The mechanics who kept 4-1-2-6-6-6 flying represented thousands of similar men whose names never appeared in official histories. They worked 16-hour shifts in tropical heat, fighting corrosion that turned aircraft aluminum into powder within months. They improvised solutions with inadequate tools and insufficient materials. They rebuilt engines under conditions that would have horrified factory engineers, and they did it all while knowing that mistakes could kill the crews who depended on them. The reality of Pacific Theatre maintenance bore no resemblance to textbook procedures. Technical manuals assumed clean workshops with proper lighting, complete tool sets, and unlimited access to replacement parts. They assumed mechanics could work methodically through repair sequences without time pressure. They assumed conditions that simply did not exist at forward bases carved from jungle and coral. At 7 Mile Drome in early 1943, the maintenance facility consisted of open-air revetments with canvas tarps for weather protection. Mechanics worked in mud during the wet season and choking dust during the dry season. Lighting came from portable generators that broke down constantly. Tools were shared between crews, with critical equipment like torque wrenches allocated by priority. Replacement parts arrived irregularly on cargo ships that might be delayed weeks by submarine activity or diverted to other theatres. When a B-17 landed with battle damage requiring immediate repair, the crew chief had to decide instantly what could be fixed, what could be improvised, and what had to wait. The official answer, consult technical orders and follow approved procedures, was useless when technical orders assumed parts that did not exist and procedures that required time unavailable. So mechanics learned which repairs could be made with materials on hand. They learned that aluminum sheet from packing crates, if cleaned and properly formed, could temporarily patch non-structural skin damage. They learned that steel cable from cargo nets could substitute for broken control cables if properly swaged and tensioned. They learned that you could swap compatible components between different aircraft models if you understood which specifications actually mattered versus which were merely administrative distinctions. This knowledge accumulated through experience, much of it painful. A mechanic who installed an improvised patch that failed in flight would see the aircraft return with worse damage or not return at all. The incentive to learn proper technique was immediate and unforgiving. Successful mechanics developed intuition about which shortcuts were safe and which were dangerous. That intuition kept aircraft flying and crews alive. Technical Sergeant Herbert Pugh, 412666's flight engineer, exemplified this expertise. He had worked on aircraft for 6 years before the war, first as a civilian mechanic and then in the Army Air Corps. He understood how metal behaved under stress, how systems interacted, where failures typically originated. When he designed the twin-gun mounts for the waist positions, he did not calculate stress loads mathematically. He knew from experience how much reinforcement was needed, because he had seen what happened when reinforcement was insufficient. This practical knowledge was more valuable than theoretical training because it incorporated real-world variables that theory ignored. Theory assumed perfect materials and ideal conditions. Experience accounted for corrosion, fatigue, and the compromises necessary when perfect materials were unavailable. A mechanic with 5 years of field experience often understood aircraft better than an engineer with a degree but no hands-on work. The Army Air Forces gradually recognized this reality. In 1944, they established formal programs to collect field modifications and evaluate them for broader implementation. Technical representatives from Wright Field traveled to combat theaters to interview mechanics and observe their techniques. The most successful modifications were documented in technical bulletins and distributed throughout the service. One such bulletin, issued in July 1944, described procedures for reinforcing B-17 nose sections against head-on fighter attacks. The techniques came directly from modifications crews like the Eager Beavers had developed a year earlier. The bulletin gave official sanction to work mechanics had been doing anyway, protecting them from potential disciplinary action while spreading proven solutions to units that had not yet discovered them. Another bulletin documented improved methods for patching battle damage to wing structures. The official procedure involved cutting away damaged sections and riveting in replacement panels fabricated from new aluminum. The field modification used patches cut from salvaged aircraft, welded rather than riveted because welding was faster and created stronger repairs. The bulletin acknowledged that welded repairs, while not meeting peacetime airworthiness standards, provided adequate strength for combat operations and significantly reduced repair time. These bulletins represented a fundamental shift in how the military approached technical development. Instead of centralized design with field implementation, the process became iterative feedback where field experience informed official doctrine. This worked because combat operations created selection pressure that eliminated ineffective techniques while amplifying successful ones. If a modification helped crews survive, other crews adopted it. If a modification caused failures, it disappeared. The result was organic evolution of best practices, driven by combat effectiveness rather than administrative preference. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But this evolution came at a cost. The mechanics who developed these techniques worked under constant pressure, knowing mistakes could be fatal. They made decisions without adequate information or resources. They took risks that would be unacceptable in peacetime because the alternative was leaving aircraft grounded. The stress was immense and unrelenting. Staff Sergeant William Vaughan, the ball turret gunner on 412666, later recalled watching maintenance crews work through the night before missions. They'd be out there with flashlights, welding patches on wing panels at 2 a.m. because we had a mission at dawn. No sleep, just work until the aircraft was ready. And they'd watch us take off, knowing that if their repairs failed, we wouldn't come back. That's pressure I can't even imagine. The relationship between flight crews and maintenance crews developed intense loyalty. Pilots knew their lives depended on mechanics who often worked in obscurity. Mechanics took pride in keeping their assigned aircraft flying despite impossible conditions. When Captain Zeamer brought 412-666 back from Bougainville, shot to pieces but still airborne, the ground crew felt vindicated. Their unauthorized modifications had worked exactly as intended, holding together under combat stress that would have destroyed a standard aircraft. That validation mattered deeply to mechanics whose work was never publicly acknowledged. They received no medals for their innovations. Their names did not appear in after-action reports. The modifications they developed were often attributed to anonymous sources or described as if they had emerged spontaneously. Recognition came only from the crews who flew the aircraft they maintained and the knowledge that their work made the difference between survival and loss. The statistical evidence supported this impact. Combat loss rates for B-17 seconds in the Pacific Theater decreased significantly in late 1943 and early 1944, even as Japanese fighter opposition remained intense. Part of this improvement came from better tactics and fighter escorts, but part came from modifications that increased aircraft survivability, modifications developed by mechanics working outside official channels. A study conducted by the 5th Air Force in November 1943 analyzed battle damage reports for 147 B-17 missions. Aircraft with field-modified nose armament had 23% lower loss rates than unmodified aircraft on similar missions. Aircraft with reinforced wing structures sustained battle damage but returned at rates 12% higher than aircraft with standard construction. The study's conclusion was unambiguous. Field modifications improved combat effectiveness and should be encouraged rather than restricted. This study provided official cover for practices that had been occurring informally for months. Squadron commanders who had been tacitly permitting unauthorized modifications now had documentation justifying their decisions. Maintenance officers who had been approving repairs that technically violated regulations could cite the study when questioned. The practice did not change, but the official acceptance of it did. By mid-1944, the distinction between authorized and unauthorized modifications had effectively disappeared in the Pacific Theater. If a modification improved aircraft performance or survivability, it was implemented. Documentation could be completed later if necessary. The priority was combat effectiveness, not regulatory compliance. This approach would have been impossible in the European theater, where shorter supply lines and larger maintenance facilities allowed closer adherence to official procedures. But in the Pacific, where every aircraft mattered and replacement took months rather than weeks, pragmatism overrode protocol by necessity. The 8th Air Force, operating from England against targets in occupied Europe, faced different constraints. They had access to extensive depot-level maintenance facilities at bases like Burtonwood and Wharton. Damaged aircraft could be ferried to these facilities for complete rebuilds following technical manual procedures. Parts availability was better. Replacement aircraft arrived more frequently. The pressure to improvise was less intense. But even in Europe, field modifications proliferated when combat conditions demanded them. The famous Memphis Belle, one of the first B-17 seconds to complete 25 missions, carried several unauthorized modifications, including additional armor plating around the pilot's positions and modified gun mounts in the waist. The modifications were never officially documented because they violated weight and balance specifications, but they stayed on the aircraft because they worked. Similar patterns appeared on hundreds of other bombers. Ground crews added armor protection that exceeded authorized weight limits. They modified gun positions to improve fields of fire. They installed equipment that appeared in no technical order. Commanders looked the other way because modified aircraft came home more often than unmodified ones, and that was the statistic that mattered. The most dramatic example of European field modifications involved damage repair rather than preemptive changes. When heavily damaged B-17 seconds landed at forward bases or made forced landings in fields, recovery crews had to decide whether aircraft could be made airworthy for ferry flights to proper repair facilities. Official doctrine said extensively damaged aircraft should be dismantled and transported by ground. but dismantling a 4-engine bomber required significant labor and equipment. If the aircraft could be made minimally airworthy, flying it out saved time and resources. This created situations where mechanics performed repairs that would horrify safety inspectors but worked well enough for one-time flights. The story of a telegraph pole used to strengthen a damaged fuselage, mentioned earlier, exemplified this approach. Whether that specific incident occurred exactly as described or represented an embellishment of actual repairs is less important than the underlying truth. Mechanics routinely exceeded their authority to recover valuable aircraft. One well-documented case involved B-17F Stella, which made a forced landing in an oat field near RAF Grafton Underwood in October 1943 with 3 engines inoperative. Official procedure called for dismantling the aircraft and transporting it by road. Instead, a recovery team brought portable machine shops to the field, fabricated a temporary runway using earth-moving equipment, and rebuilt enough of the aircraft's systems to fly it out. The entire operation took 12 days and returned a bomber to service that would otherwise have taken months to recover. The film footage of this recovery, shot by Army Air Forces photographers, was used as a training film to demonstrate field repair capabilities. It showed mechanics working in improvised conditions, using portable equipment to perform complex repairs without reference to technical manuals. The message was clear. Properly trained and equipped mechanics could overcome almost any damage if given the authority to work creatively. This philosophy, born from necessity in combat theaters, influenced post-war military maintenance doctrine. The Air Force established formalized programs for capturing field modifications and accelerating their approval. The technical order system was reformed to allow faster updates based on operational experience. The rigid distinction between authorized and unauthorized procedures was replaced with a more flexible framework that recognized combat conditions might require deviation from peacetime standards. The legacy of mechanics like Technical Sergeant Herbert Pugh and thousands of others like him extended far beyond their individual contributions. They demonstrated that effective maintenance required not just technical skill, but judgment, initiative, and willingness to take responsibility for decisions that could not wait for approval from distant headquarters. They proved that regulations existed to serve mission success, not the reverse, and they established a culture where mechanics were expected to think, not just follow checklists. Modern military maintenance still reflects these lessons. Aircraft maintainers today receive more authority to make field decisions than their World War II predecessors. Technical data is updated more rapidly based on operational feedback. The approval process for modifications, while still rigorous, explicitly accounts for urgent operational requirements. The fundamental principle established during World War II endures. The people closest to the work often understand problems and solutions better than distant authorities. But the original mechanics paid a price for this progress. Many worked themselves to exhaustion, maintaining aircraft under impossible conditions. Some made mistakes that cost lives, mistakes that haunted them forever afterward. Others succeeded brilliantly but received no recognition because their work existed outside official channels. The vast majority simply did their jobs day after day, keeping aircraft flying, enabling the missions that would eventually win the war. When the war ended, most of these mechanics returned to civilian life and civilian jobs. They did not discuss their wartime work extensively, partly because much of it remained technically classified, and partly because it simply was not the sort of thing veterans talked about. The pilots and crews who flew combat missions received recognition. The mechanics who made those missions possible worked in obscurity. Technical Sergeant Herbert Pugh returned to Pennsylvania after the war and worked as an automotive mechanic until his retirement. He rarely mentioned his service with the Eager Beavers, except to close friends. When asked about the Bougainville mission, he would shrug and say the modifications were just common sense, nothing special. The twin-gun mounts? We needed more firepower, so we installed more guns. Wasn't complicated. The reinforced structure. You see where damage occurs, you strengthen those areas. Basic maintenance. This modesty was typical of World War II veterans, but it also reflected a fundamental truth about the work. What appeared extraordinary in hindsight seemed ordinary to those doing it. They were solving problems with available resources under time constraints. The fact that regulations did not permit their solutions was less important than the fact that solutions were necessary. They did what needed doing and moved on to the next problem. The aircraft they maintained, like B-17, E-412666, have largely disappeared. Of more than 12,700 B-17 seconds built, only about 45 survive in any form today. Only 4 remain in flying condition. The rest were scrapped after the war, their aluminum recycled, their history lost, the modifications that kept them flying, the improvised repairs that brought crews home, the unauthorized changes that improved combat effectiveness, all disappeared with the aircraft. What remains is the record of missions completed, targets destroyed, and crews who survived because mechanics kept aircraft airworthy, despite regulations that said repairs were impossible without parts that did not exist, and time that was not available. That record exists in mission reports, loss statistics, and the memories of veterans who knew that skilled mechanics made the difference between success and failure. The final statistics tell the story starkly. The 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific completed approximately 1,900 B-17 missions between December 1941 and August 1945. They lost approximately 150 aircraft to all causes, including combat, accidents, and operational losses. That represents a loss rate of about 8%, remarkably low given the intensity of combat and the challenges of Pacific operations. In contrast, the 8th Air Force in Europe, operating with better logistics and more resources, sustained loss rates approaching 15% during the period from late 1942 through mid-1943. These rates did not decline significantly until long-range fighter escorts became available in early 1944. Multiple factors explain the difference, including enemy capabilities, mission types, and tactical doctrine. But one factor was undeniably the Pacific Theater's tolerance for field modifications that increased aircraft survivability. When B-17 seconds in the Pacific carried additional defensive armament developed through unauthorized modifications, they shot down more attacking fighters and sustained less critical damage. When they incorporated reinforced structure in areas prone to battle damage, they survived hits that would have destroyed unmodified aircraft. When mechanics repaired damage using improvised techniques, aircraft returned to service faster than official procedures would have allowed. These advantages compounded over thousands of missions. The Army Air Forces never formally acknowledged that combat effectiveness in the Pacific depended partly on systematic violation of maintenance regulations. Official histories praised the courage of aircrews and the effectiveness of tactics. They rarely mentioned mechanics who worked outside approved procedures or the modifications that gave crews critical advantages. The story remained largely untold because officially it had never happened, but the veterans knew. Captain Jay Zeamer, in interviews decades after the war, always credited his crew's survival over Bougainville to the modifications Technical Sergeant Pugh and others had installed. Those twin-waist guns made the difference, he would say. We could engage multiple fighters simultaneously instead of trying to track one target at a time. The Zeros didn't expect that firepower from a lone bomber. It disrupted their tactics just enough to give us an edge. He would also note, carefully, that the modifications had been informally approved or adapted from field experience, avoiding explicit admission that they violated regulations. Even decades after the war, even after receiving the Medal of Honor and retiring as a lieutenant colonel, he protected the mechanics who had done the work. Admitting they had violated regulations might reflect poorly on them, even retroactively. Better to suggest the modifications existed in a grey area where regulations were unclear rather than explicitly violated. This protective instinct was common among World War II veterans who understood that many of their survival techniques had existed outside official doctrine. Pilots who dove bombers below minimum safe altitude to escape fighters would describe it as tactical maneuvering rather than violating flight envelopes. Crew chiefs who swapped parts between different aircraft models would say they were cross-utilizing compatible components rather than violating inventory procedures. The language created plausible deniability while acknowledging underlying truth. Modern readers might find this evasion frustrating, Why not simply admit that regulations were inadequate and combat necessity required flexibility? The answer lies in understanding military culture and the importance of regulations to safety and order. Publicly stating that regulations were routinely violated, even for good reasons, would undermine confidence in the entire regulatory system. Better to maintain the fiction that everything occurred within guidelines, however creatively interpreted, than to suggest rules could be safely ignored. This tension between rules and reality remains relevant today. Modern militaries still struggle to balance standardization against flexibility, control against initiative, safety against operational necessity. The solutions developed during World War II, tacit acceptance of field modifications, rapid feedback from operational experience to update official doctrine, and trust in the judgment of experienced personnel, still inform how militaries approach these challenges. The mechanics who kept B-17 seconds flying in the Pacific Theatre demonstrated that effective organizations must allow skilled personnel to exercise judgment when circumstances demand it. Regulations provide necessary structure, but rigid adherence to regulations in dynamic situations can be counterproductive. Finding the balance requires trust, competence, and willingness to accept risk. That balance was found during World War II, not through policy decisions or official pronouncements, but through the accumulated experience of thousands of mechanics, making thousands of decisions about how to keep aircraft flying under impossible conditions. They developed solutions that worked, shared those solutions informally, and created a body of practical knowledge that eventually became official doctrine. The story of 4-1-2-6-6-6 and the eager beavers represents this larger pattern in miniature. One crew, one aircraft, one set of modifications that violated regulations but proved their worth in combat. The same pattern repeated across hundreds of aircraft and thousands of mechanics throughout the Pacific. The cumulative effect was a maintenance system that functioned despite inadequate resources, hostile environment, and regulations written for conditions that no longer applied. When the war ended and historians began writing accounts of the air campaign, they focused on combat operations, strategic decisions, and technological developments. They rarely mentioned maintenance, and when they did, they described it as routine work following established procedures. The improvisation, creativity, and rule-breaking that made maintenance effective remained hidden because officially it had not occurred. But it had occurred, constantly and necessarily, and the veterans who experienced it understood that victory depended not just on courage in combat, but on skill and initiative in maintenance. The pilots who flew missions got the medals. The mechanics who made those missions possible got the satisfaction of seeing aircraft return safely and crews survive. For most of them, that was recognition enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.